As you will know, Truefire sponsored this channel, but I wanted to just shout out that at the moment they're doing their best deal that they ever do, and a bit better. The All Access membership available for $79. All Access membership lasts a year. Basically, you can dip in and out of all of their courses on there. Amazing players like Robin Ford, Andy Timmons, Tim Miller, etc, etc. Check out the link in the description if you're interested. Okay, it's New Year's Eve, and hopefully if you're watching this, by the time you're watching this, maybe some parts of the world it will be 2025, maybe in other parts of the world it will be nearly 2025, but I hope you're having a good time with your family, if possible, and you're in relatively decent health and all that sort of stuff. Thank you for stopping by the channel this year. I know I make a lot of videos, I know it probably annoys a bunch of people, but if you're here regularly, I think, yeah, thanks for stopping by. I saw DippedInTone podcast, Rhett and Zach had on basically Reverb's data analyst. My buddy Jason Wade sent me this in the Facebook Messenger, and I thought it was really interesting. It's actually the first year that I know of that there's not been a tube amp in the top 20 best-selling amps of 2024 on Reverb. Now that's not great to hear if you're someone who really likes tube amps. I am. And not great to hear if you're someone who maybe thinks that some of the digital stuff has its place, but maybe replacing a lot of the analog stuff, which I think is a view that quite a lot of people hold, right? I don't know if you're one of those guys. In the comments, feel free to, you know, let people know your opinion. But I kind of just wanted to talk about it a bit because I thought it was interesting. Reverb didn't actually publish this list this year. It's just, this is, I think, the only place you could actually find this information. But the top 5 amps that were in the top 20 were the Neural DSP Quad Cortex, then the Spark amp, then the Line 6 Helix, quite surprisingly, then the Universal Audio Oxbox, and then the Boss Katana. So, you know, 2 modelers. A Katana is a digital amp, they don't call it a modelling amp. The Ox is an attenuator with a low box, and then the Spark is also like a modelling micro amp. What is going on here, I guess, is the question. Is it that tube amps are too expensive? Is it that tube amps are too loud? Is it that people are really finding that this modelling stuff actually works really well for a lot of scenarios? I don't know, let me know your thoughts. I'm going to do some playing now, probably through a modeler. That's what I tend to do. As a modelling guy,
I don't think people really like you having feet in both camps. So I'm someone who's got, you know, like a little bit of vintage gear right here behind me. I do use an amp when I gig most of the time if I'm allowed to on the gig. But because I'm so involved in modelling, I think people just generally assume that you're a modelling guy. That's been my experience. Like, the guys that use tube amps and that are totally purist about it don't really like to discuss the digital stuff at all, or much discussion about it, which is only a shame for me, I guess. It doesn't really matter for anyone else, does it? But the number 22 on the list was a Vox AC15. Now, this is what is interesting to me, because last year, 2023, there were actually a few tube amps that made it onto the list. 10, the Orange Terra Stamp, I think that's a hybrid. There was the Orange Dark Micro, I think that's also hybrid, so it's got a tube in it. There was the Orange MT20 Micro Terra, again, I think that has a tube in it. There was the PRS MT15 Mark Tremonti, that's all tube. There was number 17, the Marshall Studio Vintage SV20. So, oh, and also above that, the Fender Blues Junior. So that's like 5 or 6 tube amps that were in the top 20. So it's kind of interesting to me. And also when you think about a bunch of those, like, this was one of the comments that I was seeing in the comments on DippedInTone, that tube amps are getting too expensive. Well, actually, there are a bunch of inexpensive things. Like a Vox AC15 isn't a load of money. A Blues Junior is quite affordable. A Fender Hot Rod Deluxe, those aren't terribly expensive either. You know, you could get like a little Fender Champ, get a Fender Princeton. All of these things around sort of $1,000 under it. If you're buying new, maybe a little bit more for something like a Princeton, but not hugely expensive. I think we tend to, in my mind, when I'm thinking, yeah, tube amps are really expensive, I'm thinking of things like maybe a Mesa Boogie, maybe a Friedman, maybe those sorts of amps, which absolutely, yes, or like a Two Rock. But I think we kind of, do we count things like an AC15 in the same way? I don't know. But maybe that's why people are saying like these things are expensive. But I think you can put together like a gigging setup with a tube amp, or home setup with a tube amp, that doesn't have to cost tons and tons. Like, it's not all about Two Rocks. It's not all about, you know, really expensive amps. There are plenty of not expensive amps. Even like a Silver Jubilee. These are not terribly expensive, like 1,500, 1,000, that sort of amount of money. Which is probably roughly about what you might pay for a modeler anyway, right? Like a Quad Cortex is about 1,400. Helix is about 1,200 at the moment. The thing that is going to be the problem here, I think, is that there's two things going on. So one, if people are buying less new amps, then it's going to be difficult, and increasingly difficult, I think, for companies to keep building these amps. And even, I think, the most digital guy in the world would probably say that the world is a better place if amp building is still going on, right? And if it's affordable for normal people, and not just people that are, you know, being either paid to make videos or, you know, being sent gear for free, you know, that doesn't really translate to the real world particularly well, I don't think. The price of amps, if they scale production down even more and become more boutique, is probably going to keep on increasing, and probably you're going to get like amp companies that are just having to like struggle, or, you know, like the big amp companies now like Fender and Marshall, who are branching out to these other things that are not going to make the purists happy either. You know, like, I think a Fender Deluxe Reverb reissue is a great thing. Lots of people really like the Tone Masters and stuff, but the tube amp purist is probably not going to be that impressed, you know, with a Marshall headphone amp and all of these sorts of things that possibly take away in their mind from, you know, what a Marshall amp should be. You know, it's not about Bluetooth speakers, is maybe the thought in their head. The other kind of thought I had on this was, like, if you are a tube amp purist, are you even buying new amps? Are you even buying modern amps? And my thought on this is that we're told by a lot of the purist guys that the older stuff is the better stuff anyway, which, again, really doesn't help the amp industry much, because it's like, well, right, well, you can find vintage Fender stuff for not crazy money, like the equivalent of a Two Rock, or maybe even half the price of a Two Rock, maybe even a quarter of the price of a Two Rock. See, I can find like 1960s Fenders on eBay, even in the UK, for £1,000–1,500. Is that helping the amp industry? Probably not. That's what's being said to us, is like the older stuff is sounds better, was made better. So that's a question for like your tube amp purists. Like, what about the modern amps, and are you helping the amp industry? Are people buying new amps as much in general? Probably not, because there's so many used amps, and there's people that are offloading a bunch of amps, you know, people that have had a lot and maybe have less, maybe people that have decided that they're going down the modelling route. There's like quite a lot of used amps available, and the used amp market, I imagine, I've got no data on this, but it's probably quite hard to compete with if you're trying to sell a new amp, because it's like, well, these amps in general don't see a ton of use. You know, like for instance, this deluxe reverb, pretty tidy. My buddy David Beebe bought a deluxe reverb off of someone who bought it during lockdown, never really left the house. You can get like a basically brand new tube amp, pay half the price for it. You know, that's another aspect which is making it really hard, I think, for the amp industry. So I don't know if there's any silver lining to any of this. I guess if you're someone who wants to see the back of tube amps, which I'm not sure that many of us really do, I think there's a lot of people that are maybe happy not to have like back problems and stuff like that. But I think a lot of us, probably even us in the digital world, would like to see the amp industry continue to be a thing. But I think it seems like, and this was kind of the thing that Rhett was and Zach were talking about, like the pendulum is kind of swinging to the digital side. Rhett's hoping that it swings back, but I think for it to swing back, you're going to need, you know, a big chunk of people that are going to buy a new amp. And are people buying new amps anymore? The data seems to suggest that maybe not. So that's kind of a thought as well. Like, if you want to support the amp industry, buying a used amp is not really going to help these companies too much, which is a bit of a shame. But put your money where your mouth is, I guess. Buy yourself a Two-Rock. Is that the thing to do? I don't know. It's kind of hard. As someone who likes both, it's a bit like, well, it's not what you want to hear, is it? That there's only digital amps being sold these days and modelers. But kind of, maybe it is what it is. I don't know. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And as I say, have a happy new year. And yeah, I'll catch you in another video soon.